The county fair judging tent smelled of hay and hot canvas, and, underneath all of it, something sharp and clean and living that made three of the judges lean back over their little paper cups and go quiet. Halvard Price did not lean back. Halvard Price, who owned the largest orchard press in the valley and had told half the county that vinegar was what failure smelled like, stood at the end of the long table with a blue ribbon in his fist that he had been so sure would go to his own bottled cider that his knuckles had gone white around it. And at the far side of the tent, a small woman in a faded work coat stood very still, her hands folded, watching him the way you watch weather come in off the ridge. She said nothing. She had learned that saying nothing was often the loudest thing a person could do. 4 years earlier, this same county had agreed, more or less without meeting about it, that Wenna Cobb had lost her mind. Let me back up and tell it right, because a thing like this only makes sense from the beginning. And, by the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we?
Guess.
4 years earlier, on a grey morning at the tail end of March, when the frost was still on the fence wire and the ground was that particular kind of cold that comes up through the soles of your boots and settles in your hip bones, Wenna Cobb had 31 acres out past the bend in the Amel Road, and 11 of those acres were apple trees, so old that nobody in the valley could rightly say who had planted them. Her husband, Tam, had worked those trees for 22 years, and had known each one by a name only he used. And then one August afternoon, his heart had simply stopped while he was up a ladder in the north row, and he had come down through the branches, and that was the end of 22 years. When I was 46 then, she had no children. She had a mortgage that Tam had taken against the backfield the year the well went dry, and she had a barn with a sagging shoulder, and she had 11 acres of apple trees that produced a small, hard, tart apple that the valley called a winter keep, and that nobody wanted anymore, because the big markets down in the flats wanted apples that were red and round and shone like waxed furniture, and the winter keep was none of those things. The only buyer left for a winter keep apple was the juice plant. Now you have to understand what the juice plant was to that valley. Merrow Pressing Company sat at the low end of the Amel Road where the creek ran. A long tin building with 3 chimneys and a yard full of trucks, and it was owned by Halvard Price, who had inherited it from his father and doubled it and then doubled it again. Nearly every orchard for 11 miles sold their culls and their windfalls and their off-grade fruit to Merrow, and Halvard set the price, and the price was whatever Howard felt like that season, and there was nowhere else to sell, so the price stood. He was not a cruel man in the way of a man who enjoys cruelty. He was worse than that. He was a man who had confused the number on a thing with the truth of a thing, and he had done it for so long that he no longer knew there was a difference. That spring, with Tam 3 months in the ground and the mortgage payment due in June, Wenna took her whole crop of the previous fall's stored winter keeps, 40 bushels she had held back and kept cold in the root cellar, hoping the price would climb, and she drove them down to Merrow in Tam's old truck. Halvard Price walked out into the yard in his clean coat, and he looked at those 40 bushels of small, hard, tart apples, and he offered her $1.10 a bushel, $44, for a winter's storage and a fall's picking. He said it kindly, which was the worst of it. He said, "Wenna, I'll be honest with you, these old varieties, there's just no call for them. I'm doing you a favor taking them at all, and you might think about whether it's time to let the orchard go to someone who can put it to modern use." She looked at him a long moment. Then she said, "No, thank you," and she drove the 40 bushels back up the Amel Road, and the whole yard watched her go. And somebody laughed. That was the first thing the valley decided was crazy, turning down money when you have a June payment coming. But it was the second thing that really set the tongues going. Because 2 weeks after that, on a raw morning in the middle of April, 3 Merrow trucks came grinding up the Amel Road at dawn, and they did not stop at Wenna's gate to buy. They stopped at the low corner of her land where the road bent, the boggy corner nobody could plant, and they backed up to the edge of the drainage ditch, and they tipped their beds, and they dumped load after load of rotten apples, soft, brown, fermenting culls that Merrow itself had rejected, a whole winter's worth of spoilage that Halvard had been paying to haul to the county dump, except the county had just raised the tipping fee, and Wenner's boggy corner was closer, and, as far as the driver understood it, was going to be bought up by Merrow anyway, once the widow gave up. So they dumped it there. 40 tons of rotting apples, steaming faintly in the cold air, the smell of it rolling up the hill and into her open windows. Wenner walked down to the corner in her nightclothes and her husband's coat, and she stood at the edge of that reeking brown mountain, and one of the drivers, a young fellow named Dessin, who did not like doing it and would remember doing it for the rest of his life, leaned out and said, "Sorry, ma'am, Mr. Grain." Price said this parcel was as good as his, and then the trucks pulled away. Now a person is entitled, standing at the edge of 40 tons of another man's rot, dumped on her grief, to sit down in the road and weep, and she nearly did. But Wenner Cobb had a particular kind of stubbornness in her, the kind that grows best in poor ground, and, instead of weeping, she stood there in the cold, and she breathed in, and, under the stink of rot, sharp and clean, she smelled something else. She smelled the smell that had been in her kitchen every October of her married life, when Tam let a cork of cider go too long on purpose, because he liked it on his greens. She smelled vinegar. The rot at the edges was already turning. The wild yeasts and the wild bacteria of the open air were already at work, doing for free the thing that men paid good money to do in tanks. And standing there, she remembered old Weirs. Weiselbran had the small holding that bordered Wenner's on the east, and she had come from a country across the water that she never named, except to say it was a place where the winters were longer and the people were poorer, and nothing was ever thrown away. She was near 80. She kept bees and a milk goat and a row of crocks along her south wall that she tended like children. Wenner went to her that same afternoon, still smelling of the corner, and told her what Merrow had done, and Isolde listened with her hands folded and her head tipped, and when Wenner was done, Isolde did not offer sympathy. Isolde said, in her clipped and careful way, "He has given you a gift, and thinks he has given you a burden." And Wenner said, "It's 40 tons of rot, Isolde." And the old woman looked at her with pale eyes and said the thing that Wenner would carry in her chest for the next 4 years, the thing she would say to herself on the cold mornings and the failing evenings. She said, "In my country we have a saying, what the orchard rejects, the crock redeems. Nothing spoils. It only changes hands from the man who is finished with it to the woman who is not. What the orchard rejects, the crock redeems." Wenner went home and did not sleep. She did the arithmetic instead, because arithmetic was how she kept the fear at a manageable size. $44 was what Halvard thought her whole crop was worth. A June payment of $290 was what she needed to keep the land. The difference between those two numbers was the shape of her problem, and no amount of selling apples to Merrow at $1.10 a bushel was ever going to close it. The arithmetic of the juice plant was the arithmetic of a man who had decided in advance what she was worth and would spend the rest of her life proving himself right. She needed a different arithmetic. She needed to make something worth more finished than it cost to begin, and here, on her own boggy corner, steaming in the dawn, was 40 tons of raw beginning that had cost her exactly nothing. The next morning, she borrowed Isolde's smallest crock to learn the way of it, and she began. I will not pretend the first year was anything but brutal. Vinegar is patient work, and it does not care about your mortgage. You cannot rush it and you cannot fake it. First, the sugars turn to alcohol, and then, slow and quiet, a living film called the mother settles on the surface and turns the alcohol to acid, and it takes weeks, and it takes air, and it takes a steady, coolish temperature, and it takes a person willing to skim and taste and wait and taste again and not lose their nerve when a batch goes wrong and smells of nail polish and has to be poured out. Wenna lost the whole first crop. She lost the second to a fly-blown lid. Isolde came over on her slow legs and looked into the third and said, "Too warm. Move it from the window." And Wenna moved it, and the third one held. She could not use the rotting mountain in the corner. Of course, that was too far gone, too filthy, good only for the flies, but it had taught her the principle. What she used was her own winter keeps, those small, hard, tart apples that Halvard had valued at $1.10, because it turned out that the very things that made a winter keep useless to the fresh market made it magnificent for Vinegar: the high acid, the dense sugar, the tough skin that carried the wild yeast. The tartness that Halvard called a fault was, in a crock, the whole point. The wound was where the sweetness came in. She pressed her 40 rejected bushels into cider, and she set the cider to work in every clean vessel she could beg or buy, and she waited through the summer with her heart in her mouth. She missed the June payment. She will tell you that plainly. She went to the bank in the county seat and sat across from a tired man and told him she needed 60 days, and she showed him nothing but her own steadiness, because she had nothing else to show, and something in the way she sat there made him give her the 60 days. She sold Tam's truck to make a partial payment and bought a smaller, older one. She ate from her own garden and from wee Zoldy's goat. And all summer the crocks worked in the cool of the barn's north end, and the barn began to smell not of rot, but of that sharp, clean, living smell. And by September she had her first 40 gallons of finished apple cider, vinegar, dark gold, and cloudy and alive, tasting of the whole orchard at once. And here is where a lesser story would have her rush to market and be vindicated in a season. But Wenna Cobb was not a fool, and neither was Yaldy Bran. When Wenna talked of loading the truck and driving her 40 gallons down to the Valley Market, Isolde shook her head slowly. "The Valley is not ready to buy from the mad widow," she said. "If you go down now, they will taste with their eyes and their ears before their tongues, and they will find it sour, because they have already decided you are sour. Bank it. Let it deepen. A young vinegar and a young grief are the same. Both need time and dark." So Wenna banked it. She built a rack in the coolest corner of the cellar, and she racked her 40 gallons off, clean into oak. She got cheap from a broken cooperage, and she let the county go on, believing she was the poor mad widow with the reeking corner. She kept a coal banked under the ash, and she let no one see it glow. That was the fall the child began coming. Ode was 9, a thin, watchful boy from the Marley place down the road where there were too many children and not enough of anyone's attention, and he had taken to wandering, and he wandered into Wenna's barn one afternoon and found her skimming a crock, and he did not run off. He watched. The next day he came back. He had a way of standing very still and asking exactly one question, and then thinking about the answer for a long time, and Wenna, who had lost the chance at children of her own, found that she did not mind him there. He named the mother in the big crock. He called it the ghost because it was pale, and it floated, and it made the cider come alive, and the name stuck, and forever after they spoke of feeding the ghost and splitting the ghost and starting a new crock from a piece of the ghost. He had faith in the work before there was any evidence for it. He believed the vinegar was going to save the farm the way children believe things, completely and without arithmetic. And on the hard days, his belief was worth more to Wenna than her own. The second year, she doubled. She pressed the full winter keep crop, and she did not sell 1 bushel to Merrow, and Halvard noticed, because Halvard noticed anything that reduced his flow of cheap fruit. He drove up the Amel Road himself one afternoon in his clean coat and found Wenna in the yard, and he was gracious in the way that costs a proud man nothing and means less. He said he'd heard she was dabbling in something and that he admired her spirit. Truly he did, and that if she ever wanted to be shed of the whole burden, he was prepared to be generous. And he named a figure for the land that was a little more than the mortgage, and a little less than a life. Wenner wiped her hands on her apron and said, "No, thank you," and Halvard's smile tightened at the corners, and he looked past her at the barn, at the crocks he could see through the open door, and Wenner watched him do the arithmetic in his head and come up with an answer he did not like. He drove away. She said nothing to him, and nothing to anyone. By the end of that second year, she had 200 gallons banked in oak and a small, quiet trade going that nobody in the valley knew about, because she had gone around the valley entirely. Ode's oldest sister worked in the county seat and knew a woman who supplied the 2 good restaurants there, and that woman tasted Wenner's dark gold vinegar off a spoon and went very quiet the way the judges would later go quiet, and she bought 40 gallons at $9, which was a number so far above $1.10 a bushel that Wenner had to go out to the barn and sit down. Then the woman told a friend who had a shop in the city 2 hours south, a shop that sold oils and salts and small proud jars to people who cared about such things, and that shop took 60 gallons and wanted more, and by spring of the 3rd year, under a plain label that said only Amel Road, Winterkeep, Vinegar, and a small drawing Ode had made of the ghost, the arithmetic had inverted. What the orchard rejects, the crock redeems, she told no one in the valley. She paid off the mortgage in the 3rd summer, walked into the bank in the county seat with a cashier's check and set it down in front of the tired man who had given her the 60 days. And he looked at it and then at her and asked, quiet, how? And she said, apples, and left. She fixed the barn's sagging shoulder. She bought back Tam's old truck from the man she'd sold it to, paid him double, because it was the truck Tam had driven, and she could afford sentiment now. And still she said nothing to the valley, because Wisold had taught her that the valley was not ready to admit it had been wrong, and it is easier for people to believe a thing is rotten than to admit they were fools to mock it. Let them think what they liked. The coal was banked, it could wait. Then came the 4th year, and the 4th year was the reckoning. It came as fire blight. If you have never seen fire blight move through an orchard, you cannot know how fast it is, or how total. It is a bacterium, and it comes in on a wet, warm spring, and it enters through the blossoms, and it runs down the shoots and turns them black and curled as if a torch had been passed over them, so that the trees look scorched, though nothing has burned. And there is no cure, only cutting far below the black and burning what you cut. And even then you lose. And the varieties it loves best, the ones with the least resistance in their blood, are exactly the modern varieties the valley had planted everywhere, the red, round, shining apples that sold in the flats, because those had been bred for looks and sweetness and shelf life, and had had all their toughness bred out of them the way you might breed the sense out of a dog. That spring the blight came up the valley like a slow, black tide. Orchard after orchard went. The big commercial rose, the pampered grafted stock that Halvard's whole business ran on. They had no defense in them at all, and they blackened and curled and died by the acre. Marrow pressing had contracts to fill and a warehouse of empty bottles, and suddenly almost no fruit in the whole valley worth pressing. Men who had laughed in the marrow yard 4 years before now stood in their scorched rows and wept the way Wenner had nearly wept at the corner, and up on the bend of the Amel Road the old winter heaps stood green. They stood green because they were old, because they had grown up wild and hard in poor ground long before anyone thought to breed toughness out of an apple, and the same stubborn wildness that made them small and tart and worthless to the fresh market made them shrug off the blight the way they shrugged off the winters that had killed softer trees. A few shoots blackened at the edges of Wenner's rows, and she cut them and burned them as Yold told her, and that was all. 11 acres of the one variety in the whole valley that the blights could not master, and it belonged to the mad widow everyone had told to sell. Now the valley's mood curdled, and it curdled ugly before it turned sweet, because that is the true way of people, and I will not pretend otherwise. First, there was suspicion. How is it, they said, that her trees stand and ours fall? There was talk, quiet and shameful, that she'd done something, that a woman who could turn a mountain of rot into money out of a barn might be the sort who could call a blight down on her neighbour's rows while sparing her own. An old poison, that one, the poison of people who would rather believe in a witch than in their own bad judgment. Ode, 13 now, and grown taller, came running up the road one evening with his face white, because he'd heard men talking outside the feed store, and Wenner sat him down and said, "Let them talk. Talk is just fear that hasn't found its manners yet." He went on cutting her few blackened shoots and saying nothing, and her silence, which had unnerved Hallvard in the yard, now unnerved the whole valley, because you cannot argue with a woman who will not argue back. Then the suspicion gave way to need, as it always does, because a hungry man cannot afford a witch he needs. They needed clean cyanwood to regraft. They needed a resistant rootstock to build back on, and there was exactly one source in 11 miles. The green trees on the Amel Road. One by one they came up her drive, the men who had laughed, hats in their hands, and asked, not quite meeting her eyes, whether she might sell them cuttings, and when a cob, who could have named any price, who could have made them pay in full for 4 years of mockery, gave them the cuttings. She charged them the cost of her labour and not a penny more, and she showed them in the barn that no longer smelled of rot how the toughness they had bred out could be bred back in. She was building something, though they did not yet see it. She was making a valley that could not blight her out, because she had made herself its root. Which brings us back, at last, to the fair tent and the sharp, clean smell, and Halvard Price with the blue ribbon white-knuckled in his fist, because Halvard, you see, had not come to the fair to lose. Marrow pressing was drowning. His contracts were unfilled, his warehouse idle, his fruit gone black in the valley's rows, and he had heard, everyone had by now, that the mad widow's vinegar was selling in the city for prices that made his cider look like the ditch water it mostly was. So Halvard had done what proud men do when they are frightened. He had gone quietly to the city shop himself, under a false errand, and he had bought a case of Amel Road vinegar to taste what all the noise was about, and he had tasted it, and he had understood in one swallow that this small, sour widow had beaten him. And he had come to the fair with a plan and a smile and a folded paper in his coat. He waited until the judging was done, and her dark gold vinegar had taken the blue that he had wanted. And then he crossed the tent to her in front of everyone, and he was gracious, oh, he was gracious. He said, "Congratulations, Wenner. Truly, you've done a remarkable thing, and I think it's time the valley's 2 success stories joined forces." He unfolded his paper. It was an offer to buy Amel Road vinegar outright, brand and recipe, and the exclusive rights to her cyanwood, and the figure at the bottom was large, larger than anything she had ever seen, 6 figures large, and a murmur went through the tent when the nearest people saw it. And then Halvard Price, sure of himself, wanting to show the crowd he knew her business better than she did, made the one mistake that pride always makes. He tapped the paper, and he said, "It's more than fair. I know exactly what you cleared last year, Wenner, $140,000, near enough. I'm offering you more than that in one lump." Only a fool would say no. The tent went quiet, and into that quiet Wenner Cobb said, in her level voice, the voice she had kept folded up for 4 years, "Now how would you know what I cleared last year, Halvard?" Because she had never told a soul that number. Not the bank, not we sold, not owed. It was written in one place only, in her own ledger, in the drawer of her own desk in the farmhouse on the Amel Road. And Halvard Price, standing in that hay-smelling tent, went the colour of a cut blight shoot because there was no honest way for him to have that number, and everyone in the tent watched him understand that he had just said it out loud. Later it came out, plain enough. A clerk at the city shop in Halvard's pay had passed him her order figures. He had been spying on her books for a season, planning this, and in his hunger to prove he was the smarter one, he had spilled the very proof of it in front of the whole county. He had confused one last time, knowing the number of a thing with having any right to it. Wenner let the silence do its work. She had learned long ago that silence unnerves a proud man more than any shout. Then she took the folded offer from his hand, and she looked at it, and she looked at him, and she tore it once, cleanly, and set the two halves on the judging table beside her blue ribbon. "I'm not for sale," she said. And then, because Wysold had also taught her the other half of the lesson, that being right is only worth something if you build with it, she raised her voice just enough for the tent to hear. "But the cyanwood is any grower in this valley who wants to plant back with a tree that stands come up the Amel Road. I'll sell you the wood at what it cost me to cut it, same as I've been doing, and I'll teach you the vinegar too, any who want to learn, because 100 crocks feeding this valley is worth more to me than 1 crock feeding my own pride." She looked at Halvard then, and there was no cruelty in it, which was somehow worse for him than cruelty. "And you, Halvard," she said, "you've got a plant full of bottles and no fruit. I've got fruit and no plant. Come, see me Monday. We'll talk about pressing my vinegar under a valley label, and I'll pay you a fair rate, and you can be part of the thing you tried to buy instead of the thing that killed it. It's your arithmetic. The arithmetic of one man taking everything ends with one man and nothing. The arithmetic of a valley eaves everybody standing. He came Monday. Of course he came. There was nothing else left for him to do, and something in him, some old buried thing, under all the pride, was even grateful, though it would take him a year to admit it. And that is how it went. In the end, the marrow plant that had dumped 40 tons of rot on a widow's corner spent the next years bottling that widow's vinegar under a label that said the valley's name. And the scorched orchards came back on winterkeep rootstock cut from the trees on the Amel Road, and the sharp, clean, living smell that had once meant failure to Halvard Price came to mean, to that whole valley, the smell of the thing that had saved it. Wenner took Ode on properly when the Marley place fell apart, and he grew up in the vinegar and took over the crocks in time, and he never did stop calling the mother the ghost. And old Wysolder, Bran lived to see it, lived to sit in the barn's north end on a bright fall afternoon with a cup of the dark gold vinegar cut with honey and water, her pale eyes on the racks that ran now the whole length of the wall. And she said to Wenner what she had said at the beginning, though this time it landed not as comfort but as plain proven fact. "What the orchard rejects," she said, "the crock redeems." Wenner sat beside her and did not answer, because some things do not need answering, and because the boggy corner where the rot had steamed 4 springs before was clean now and green, and she had planted it that very year with a young row of winterkeeps. Nothing spoils, it only changes hands, from the one who is finished with it to the one who is not.